Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another show. Today, I have a very special guest with me. Kevin Barrett is back on my show again. Kevin is an author and a radio host who has the program Truth Jihad. And he also wrote a book about 9/11 previously, where he revealed a lot of details that were unknown to the public about 9/11. I have Kevin today with me to speak primarily about the US elections. We've had a lot of talks about potential alternatives when it comes to the United States. However, it seems like it's reinforced the way that things are going, that it's either going to be Trump or Harris. We're not seeing any likelihood of anyone getting any potential winning when it comes to the presidency. And I wanted to get your input, Kevin, with regards to the political scope and political scene in the United States. What are your thoughts on how things are developing and the likelihood of the results of the elections?
Well, it's good to be back with you, Mahmoud. And yeah, it's a crazy situation right now in the United States, as it's just gotten crazier and crazier there. Maybe throughout my lifetime, but it's certainly
Mm,
since 9/11, and when I started focusing more on politics, especially a couple of years after 9/11, when I woke up to how outrageous that cover-up was. So it just seems like it gets worse all the time and crazier all the time. And then I've seen a pattern, which is that there is a switch of administrations. People are convinced that there is a difference between the two. So the people who get upset at whatever party is in power feel like they have something to vote for to change the situation. They vote for the other party. The other party comes into power, and then not much changes. People get upset with them. Maybe people leaning towards the other side of the spectrum, they get replaced. So we've seen this, for example, with the after Clinton and Gore, in came George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, pledging to no longer be the world's policeman and to mind our own business. And then, though, after 9/11 and 8 years of craziness, they left and were replaced by the candidate of hope and change, Barack Obama. And that Obama was presented as a peace candidate, a rejection of all of the worst excesses of the Bush-Cheney post-9/11 regime. He promised to close Guantanamo to end these forever wars, but he promised them in sort of vague terms, and then he appointed Rahm Emanuel as his chief of staff, which is the most important job in the administration, probably more important than president, because the chief of staff decides who gets to see the president. And he was asked, why did you appoint Rahm Emanuel? And Obama said, quote, we owed some people. Now we can figure out who those people were. Obama is a creature not only of the CIA, which gave him his first job out of college, but also of the Pritzker family, which is the Kosher Nostra, that is Jewish organized crime. Pritzker family runs Illinois and Chicago. They made Obama what he was when he was pretending to be a community organizer, and then the skids were greased for him to win all of his elections, as terrible things would happen to his opponents and they would fall down and so on. So anyway, Obama was totally fake. He's not, there was no peace candidate there. Maybe he's a slightly more intelligent and thoughtful individual than Bush or Cheney. That's not saying much. So we got 8 years of Obama, and people got tired of Obama. And then the new alternative, of course, was Donald Trump. And he was put in there to mollify the anger of all of the anti-Obama people. And then we only had 4 years of Trump, and a lot of the populace was whipped up into Trump derangement syndrome, and they hated him. So then we got something supposedly different from Trump, not really so different, in fact, the Biden administration. And so what's going to happen next? I would guess that people are upset enough with Biden and thinking that things are bad enough that likely the managers of the empire, who put out these political faces as kind of a distraction from who really runs things, are likely going to have to change. That is, they're going to have to put in a change of scenery. And so I would actually bet on Trump. Now, superficially, Trump, surrounded by people like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and even to some extent J.D. Vance, would seem to be much more promising than the Trump who took over in 2016, surrounded by neocons like Mike Pompeo and the rest of them. So I think we're being lured into thinking that there's the likelihood of a significant change with the Trump administration. But what I would be concerned about is that the U.S. empire right now is really on the brink of declaring World War III. It's already fighting an undeclared World War III by perpetrating a genocide in occupied Palestine and by going for the jugular of Russia through Ukraine. And that then there's, of course, China, the big kahuna, and ultimately the majority of the American decision makers seem to think that war with China is inevitable, which is a terrible belief system, but they're stuck in it. So I would be concerned that Trump will be enthroned, and they may have staged a sort of a coronation ritual with that fake assassination attempt that supposedly grazed his ear just such that there could be the right amount of blood for a public relations op, and he could do his Iwo Jima photo thing in front of the flag with just some blood, streaks of blood on his face like war paint, but no damage whatsoever, no actual damage. I mean, what are the odds that the first time that somebody gets anywhere near a Trump rally with a gun, that the result is a picture-perfect PR op? It cannot be distinguished from what a bad wrestling promoter like Ari Emanuel, who is Trump's manager and also manages various professional wrestlers. This is exactly the kind of stunt that a professional wrestling promoter would do. And then, of course, Trump brought on Hulk Hogan at the Republican convention to coronate him. To me, this looks like a big kayfabe stunt. And so why?
And they spoke about the threat of Iran to assassinate him. I don't know how they included Iran in the picture.
Right. Well, that's the thing, is they brought this intelligence that Iran was after Trump. I wouldn't blame Iran if they were after Trump and various other people, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and so on. But in any case, they floated that. Then they did this fake PR stunt. Now, it's possible that they did that to sort of insure Trump against real assassination attempts, whether from Iran or its friends, or that were more likely the deep state that doesn't like Trump. There's a side of the deep state that doesn't like Trump. And some of those people actually believe their own propaganda. They're drunk on their own, supply. So those people, maybe there really is a threat to Trump. And to fix that situation, if you do a fake attack on Trump, then you can ramp up your security and you can rile up his base to the point that nobody's going to dare to actually kill him, because the base would be too angry. They already believe that they tried to kill Trump, which is what J.D. Vance has been saying. So in any case, so my analysis would be that this is basically a spectacle, and that the real managers of the empire are oligarchs, disproportionately Jewish Zionists, and that those people are also neocons. They basically want to take over the world. They're guided by a supremacist ideology, comes out of the Jewish messianic millenarian tradition by way of Protestantism to some extent. And so those people are completely insane, but they're out for World War III. We're already fighting World War III, just it hasn't been declared yet. I could mention.
Do you think so?
Oh yeah, the COVID was a U.S. bio attack on Iran and China. So if that isn't World War III, what is, right? I mean, it's deniable. Everything's deniable. We can say, well, it was just a random outbreak from bats or pangolins, or they can say that, oh, Russia attacked Ukraine, that's why we're there. They can say, well, Iran did this and that, and that's why we're fighting the axis of resistance. But the reality is, it's World War III. We're already fighting it. They just don't want to admit it because it's if you declare it, then you have to maybe break out the nukes. So they want to keep it at that deniable and containable level. And now, if you think about what Trump would bring for these people, Trump is the one guy who, if he could run on a sort of quasi-anti-war platform surrounded by RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, and then once he's in power, there could be a big false flag, and Trump could pound his alpha male chest and say, we've got to fight for America. And he's going to wave the flag. And his backers are the last people in America who actually could ever fight for anything. They're the people who disproportionately, like the people from the South who join the military, they're very conservative and patriotic, and many of them are Christians, Protestant, born again, fundamentalist Christians. And these kinds of people, they will follow Trump into an openly declared big time World War III. So that's why Trump would be useful to the neocon war party, and that may be why he will have the way paved for him to return to power.
Although Donald Trump is saying that he wants to end the war, as a matter of fact, he constantly says that if he were the president, that the Ukraine war wouldn't have happened. If he was there, somehow Hamas wouldn't have attacked Israel, only if he was there. And he's looking to end the wars. So do you think he could go against all of this talk of him ending the war by escalating for?
First, there's the issue of what did he do in his first administration as opposed to what he said. And under the Trump administration, the U.S. continued to, and in fact accelerated, bringing Ukraine into NATO in a de facto matter. They armed Ukraine to the teeth under Trump, far beyond what they had done under Obama, and prepared this war on Russia through Ukraine. That was all done under the Trump administration on Trump's watch. And then Trump personally authorized the assassination of the martyr General Soleimani. And that came very close to inciting open, uncontainable World War III right there. And then Trump's administration attacked China with the COVID bioweapon and attacked Iran with the COVID bioweapon. It was an economic attack on China that was designed to try to lower the growth differential between the US and China by crippling China's economy. And it succeeded to a certain extent. And it was also designed to take out some of the older leadership of the Islamic Republic. It went straight to Qom after Wuhan, and it killed some of the top Iranian leadership. Didn't cause regime change, of course. So Trump waged World War III during his term every bit as much as Obama, if not even more. And meanwhile, he did make these sort of anti-war noises. And we got all these stories from people like Bob Woodward about how Trump fought with his militarist advisors and didn't, he didn't want to he wanted to get out of Afghanistan, maybe even wanted to get out of Syria, which of course he didn't. And then he said, well, we're there to steal the oil. So he admitted that. So Trump was far from an anti-war candidate while he was president. And to expect something different this time, I don't know. I mean, I think Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are likely sincere in their desire to end the forever wars. They claim they've gotten a commitment from Trump that he's also on their same wavelength and wants to end these so-called forever wars. However, I'm not sure that any of those people, whether Trump, who's really not terribly bright or well-informed, nor Tulsi Gabbard or FK Jr., who are brighter and better informed, but I don't think any of those people is really anywhere near the levers of power. And so the oligarchs who have those levers of power are entirely capable of having Trump run as an anti-war candidate and make those noises, just like George W. Bush ran as a stop arresting Muslims candidate, as a stop interning Muslims candidate, a pro American Muslim anti-Zionist candidate in 2000. He also ran as an end America's policing the world candidate. So Bush was also a peace candidate. But once he got in office, the people who really run the empire blew up the World Trade Center and put a gun to Bush's head and said, read your lines. And he read his lines. So that's what they're going to do with Trump, in my opinion, is they're going to put Trump in, and then they'll have some kind of big false flag. And then they'll say, well, this is what we have to do. We're going into Ukraine now. And here's the speech you better give if you know what's good for you. And he probably would. So.
This is the first time that I heard, by the way, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on George W. Bush, because you said like his intention wasn't really to expand and go on all of these. So George Bush, you don't think that he actually wanted to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was only after he went in office and you had the 9/11, he was forced to do that, according to your side?
Well, I think there's sort of there's evidence that you could use to support either argument with Bush. The strongest evidence that Bush was ever on board with those wars before 9/11 happened and they put the gun to his head was in January of 2000, according to his then Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, who later went public about this. Bush's initial meeting of all of his top advisors in the White House involved a lot of attention was being paid to going to war with Iraq. And they had a lot of details about this coming war with Iraq. And Paul O'Neill was kind of horrified by that. And Bush's attitude, according to Paul O'Neill, was that he finally ended that discussion by saying, "Show me a way to get it done." So that, if that's true, it probably is, that would indicate that Bush was open to a war on Iraq at that point. Now, it's also possible that 9/11 was obviously designed long before Bush took over in 2000. Uh,
Mm.
but it's very likely that the national security people would have told Bush, okay, we're going to have a kind of a provocation. You probably are better off not knowing the details, but would
Mm.
you mind signing on this little dotted line here? Maybe they do it that way. I don't know.
Mm.
And so it's possible that Bush authorized some kind of provocation in relatively vague terms. I think it's
Mm.
very, very, very unlikely that Bush would have known the details about 9/11, allegedly hijacked planes crashing into targets, buildings being blown up, all of this.
Mm.
That's not really something that almost anybody in that position of an American president, especially somebody kind of a prosaic person like Bush, would obviously be interested in. So
Mm.
I'm sure they didn't give him all the details of 9/11. So then when it happened, and I think, he was, they whispered in his ear, that was,
Yeah, when he was with the kids with the upside down book, right?
yeah. Well, actually,
Yeah.
actually, the upside down book, I think that was maybe Photoshop, but
Oh, was
he
it?
did. He sat there reading that book, the Pet Goat book,
Okay.
for 10 minutes after he had supposedly had whispered in his ear by his advisor Andrew Card that
Mm.
America is under attack. That's the official story. But if you look at the tape, Card brings his whispers about 3 syllables. That's all, and that really
Mm.
quick. So he couldn't have actually said anything of substance.
Mm.
All he could have said is something like "game on." So Bush
Mm.
knows there's some game on. He doesn't know what it is,
Mm.
and he's just glad handling and shaking hands and reading for 10 minutes to the kids. Now, he could have been a target, right? So if this had been an
Mm.
actual attack on America that wasn't scripted and controlled, the Secret
Mm.
Service would have gotten him out of there instantly. They would have just
Mm.
snatched him away. But no, uh, he, they let him stay there reading the book
That's
for
the
10 minutes.
picture.
Right, and
Mm.
then he talked there for. He didn't even get out of that classroom until about 9:30, and
Mm.
it was almost 10 o'clock before his leisurely motorcade made it to the airport, and he
Mm.
got on Air Force One and flew off. Now, Air Force One was then threatened. There was a threat that came in from somebody who had the codes for Air Force One. The Angel is Next threat. Uh,
Mm.
Bush had originally uh, told them to take him back to Washington. Somebody said no. Maybe this threat was used as the excuse to say no. So he's no longer in command. He says, "Take me to Washington." They say, "No, Mr. Sorry." And they
You
say,
can't go to Washington. Yeah.
"You gotta go to Washington and take charge, even though you're the president." Why? Well,
Yeah.
because now Dick Cheney is acting president, because this has already been planned in advance. So Bush, they tell him he's going to Barksdale, Louisiana, the second most corrupt U.S. Air Force base, for drug smuggling and things like that, white slavery, or whatever they call it,
Mm.
human trafficking. Then they take him instead to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, the most corrupt Air Force base. That's where Boys Town little boys were trafficked. That was part of the Franklin scandal. If you read the book, The Franklin Cover-Up or The Franklin Scandal, you'll find that a high-level Republican operative who owned a savings and loan there actually and sang, he sang the national anthem at the Republican convention in New Orleans one year. That guy had kids in his basement that he was trafficking to the highest level political police and intelligence leaders in the United States, and corporate wealthy people as well. So, and that's all, a lot of that is operated in conjunction with Offutt Air Force Base and the Boys Town Orphanage. So that Offutt Air Force Base is the number one most corrupt air base in America after Barksdale. And they take Bush there, and he spends hours there. He wants to go back to Washington, apparently, to take charge, but they won't let him. So he finally, then hours later, they do fly him back to Washington. He gets in front of a camera and makes basically what looks a lot like a hostage video, saying, America is under attack, and we will do whatever it takes to get those evildoers. Uh,
Mm.
and so how do we interpret? Oh, and I should admit that the morning of 9/11, before the 9/11 terror attack, there was an assassination attempt on Bush at his hotel, in which some Somali, what should we call them? Some Somali mercenaries who were working for U.S., Israel, whatever, dressed up as cameramen, came to claim they had an interview with Bush that morning, and he was kept away from those cameramen by alert security people. Otherwise, theoretically, he might have suffered the same fate as General, was it Massoud in Afghanistan, who had been blown up by a camera crew like the day before this. In any case, so Bush, I think Bush was coerced into going along with a deep state plan that was primarily engineered by the Israelis, who have their hooks in the American deep state and especially the American neoconservative establishment. And so just like Bush, with whatever, whether he was sincere or not, and I think he probably was when he ran for office, saying no more policing the world, and no more kidnapping Muslims who are suspected of being quote unquote anti-Israel terrorists, right? He promised that to Samuel Arian, the #1 American Muslim political activist, who in fact put Bush in the White House in 2000, because he went to both sides, Democrats and Republicans, and said, will one side promise to stop kidnapping anti-Zionist Palestinians mostly, and Muslims in general? And the Bush campaign promised to do that, and the Democrats wouldn't. So Samuel Arian, then using his really formidable organizational skills, basically flipped the election. In previous elections, the American Muslims had voted Democratic by about 90 to 10%. But in that particular election, 2000, it was flipped. It was about 90 to 10 for the Republicans, thanks to the efforts of Samuel Arian and his organization, particularly in Florida, where Sammy lived at the time. So the Muslim votes in Florida that went to Bush were far more than enough to cover that difference. In other words, Bush was able to steal the election by claiming that he won Florida, and he would never have been able to claim that, not even close, if Samuel Arian hadn't made that deal with the Bush campaign. And then did Bush hold up his side of the deal? Well, interestingly enough, Samuel Arian kind of kept getting put off and postponed during the first year of Bush's presidency. But then he finally got a White House appointment where Bush was supposed to sign the executive order that would end these non-detentions without charges of Muslims, mostly Palestinians, that the Israelis didn't like. And that meeting was set for, guess what, September 11th, 2001. So Samuel Arian was actually in D.C., ready to meet with Bush and have Bush sign an executive order ending the pretrial chargeless detentions of Muslims on that day, September 11th. But something else happened that morning, and Bush was unable to meet with Samuel Arian and sign that document. And then what was it, a year or something later, the Zionists, who had taken power with this coup, brought these trumped up charges against Samuel Arian, calling him a terrorist. Their only evidence really was that he had said, during impassioned speeches, he had said death to Israel. And then he also had helped a number of Palestinians with their visa immigration papers or what have you. And supposedly a couple of them were somehow linked to Hamas. So they whipped up this completely bogus prosecution. Samuel Arian spent many years in prison fighting these prosecutions. And ultimately, there was a deal that allowed him to be released, but he was basically kicked out of the country. So he's been working as a journalist and academic in Turkey ever since. So
based on your research, George Bush wasn't connected to the lobby before the elections, before he was elected?
Well,
or did he cover that up?
The Bush family historically has been quite corrupt. And perhaps tangentially involved in some of the Israel lobby and organized crime apparatus's activities, but probably less controlled than many other people. So when George H.W. Bush was in power, for example, he insisted on selling AWACS to Saudi Arabia, even though the Israelis told him not to. He also tried to force Israel to sign a peace accord that would get them out of the occupied territories, and they plotted to kill him. There was actually an Israeli plot to kill George H.W. Bush in Madrid. In what year was that? That would have been whatever, late 80s, when Bush was pressuring the Israelis to accept a deal that they didn't want. So So the Bush family historically, despite its corruption and despite, Bush, H.W. Bush was undoubtedly involved in some level, probably a relatively low level in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which was primarily an Israeli operation, just like 9/11 was. But there was a CIA element involved in that as well. And Bush was with the CIA at the time, and he probably wouldn't have had the big picture. But the Bush
Mm,
family, then again, has really not been a totally 100% Zionist-controlled family. They have been a little more Anglo elite, WASP elite, the old traditional American elite that has been supplanted by the Jews, who now completely control America. And
mm,
so Bush Jr. really went against his father's wishes when he allowed himself to be hijacked by the neocons. And that's pretty much on the record that H.W. Bush was very disappointed in Jr. For going along with all of this post 9/11 craziness that the neocons had ginned up. And there are rumors that they may have blackmailed him. There are rumors that H.W. Bush, like others in the Bush family, are quite perverse, and that there are pictures of George W. Bush Jr. Um, doing unfortunate things with children at a brothel devoted to such things in the Caribbean.
mm,
Allegedly, General Noriega had some of those pictures and tried to get a bigger cut of the drug money based on his leverage from having those pictures. And H.W. Bush, who was president at the time, or vice president, I forget which, then ordered the invasion of Panama to basically put an end to the problem caused by General Noriega. So these probably Bush, like so many other people who reach high levels of power in the United States, is blackmailed by the Zionists, and that may be one of the reasons that he went along with this. And that could have happened when he was kidnapped on 9/11 and taken to Offutt Air Force Base. They very well may have shown him some of the pictures they had and
mm,
essentially said, you're going along with us or else. Or maybe they'd convinced him already, because there's some evidence that somewhere along the line he kind of more or less went over to their side and adopted this sort of quote unquote Christian Zionist perspective of his own volition, and became sort of, he ended up rationalizing what he was doing. He's not a very smart man, but he rationalized
mm,
his activities by his quote unquote religious faith.
mm. So, in essence, you're seeing the continuation of the same thing: a lobby with massive control in the back, blackmailing, controlling, running the strings, false flags, or at least false flag involvement, depending on how far you interpret it and who do you include in that interpretation. And it looks like we're having the same thing now when it comes to the current candidates, and everyone is of course talking about either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. How likely is that to change one day? And do you think the continued focus on the two candidates that are likely to get it is part of the problem? Like the fact that we're only saying it's either Kamala or Trump, that's also part of the problem. And we are establishing in people's minds that there is no alternative because, hey, Jill Stein, for example, she's just going to steal some votes and affect Kamala. Likewise with Dr. Cornel West, for example, or whichever candidate coming. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's true. And in fact, I actually just wrote a satirical article about that very topic. And I think the title of my article is something like, I had a dream about this election, and
Mm,
described a pollster coming to my house and saying, if the election were held today, would you vote, which of these two candidates would you vote for, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? And then, of course,
mm,
take it from there in resisting those two alternatives, but the pollster then applying more and more force and threats to try and force me to
mm,
stick with those two alternatives. And of course, I
mm,
grossly exaggerated. It's a satirical, humorous, but kind of very, very dark kind of humor in that
mm,
article. But yeah, I think that's actually true, which is why I wrote that article. Is
mm,
that tremendous amount of coercion is being applied to us to vote for one of these two candidates, because we're told, well, they're the only ones who can win. Why are they the only ones who can win? Well, because the oligarchs who own the media and these candidates, they're the only ones that they will accept. Well,
mm, mm.
I wouldn't vote for either of those two people if you held a gun to my head, which is the sort of thing I
Yeah.
wrote about in the satirical article, is having the pollster,
Mm,
talking about guns held to heads and things like that. Uh,
mm,
So yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, people are brainwashed into believing that somehow their vote counts, that somehow it's a democracy, and it's ridiculous. Obviously, one vote doesn't count, even if it really were a democracy in every other way. But it's not a democracy; it's an oligarchy, and these candidates are
Mm,
just frontmen and showmen. And it's like
mm,
professional wrestling, where you have one black
mm,
hat and a white hat. Only one group thinks that the black hat is the white hat, and the white hat is the black hat. The other group thinks the other thing. And
mm.
it's so I think the first step to improving the situation is to deprogram people to stop falling for that shtick.
You see, the funny thing is, when you go back in history and read about the Greek democracy, you would have seen that difference from that time. So when you spoke about the Athenian democracy, they were genuinely interested about having a democracy and a representation. It wasn't perfect, but they had attempts to try and refine it. Some of their philosophers were always discussing on how things can be improved, who can participate in this democratic process, how we can continuously improve it. On the other hand, you had Sparta. Sparta was a militaristic oligarchy from that time, expansionist, ruled by the rich and expands by power. And they don't care about anything. So you're talking about a pattern that's thousands of years old and is only taking different shapes now. Now they're giving us the slogans that we like. So they're telling you democracy, and they're telling you equality, and they're telling you human rights just to pacify you, so that you can be pacified. And it seems like, of course, some people would be aware of that. Many people won't. That's why they constantly fall into the same trap. But what's the solution, in your opinion, to that?
Well, I think talking about ancient Greece and the creation of democracy, I think that the classical philosophical and religious traditions that have fallen by the wayside in today's civilization still have a lot to teach us. For instance, the philosophical traditions teach us about the importance of virtue, and that the real issue is not so much whether something is democratic or not, but it's virtue versus vice. That is, that the classical philosophers, starting with Plato, who today actually Plato is not very popular because he's seen as not being a big fan of democracy, and then he's a eugenicist because in his Republic he has this component of sort of breeding this elite that then they're the guardians of the society, and so on and so forth. And I can understand some of these criticisms. However, I think that Plato and the other ancient philosophers were largely right in their contempt for democracy. That is, they didn't think democracy was a great thing. They thought that there were essentially, well, Plato talks about a cycle of dictatorship or tyranny, and then oligarchy, and then democracy, and that they kind of just go round and round and round. As with democracy, the idea is that the will of the greater number should always be implemented. And that would make sense, I suppose, if the greater number had a good chance of always being virtuous and right. But Plato and other ancient philosophers believed the contrary. They believed that the kind of the great masses of people probably are going to, they're not going to be right very often, and they're not really very virtuous. That only a relatively small number of people cultivate virtue of any kind. And so that, what you want is a virtuous government and not a vicious government. And the way you're going to get that isn't by just turning it over to a majority vote. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like today, we have this phenomenon known as the long tail. It's a graph, and you see this graph applied everywhere. For instance, with like pick websites. Like
Mm,
let's say with your people's following online, right? So there's a very small number of people who have huge followings online, right? So at the graph, you have this high, the line's way up high, and then the line comes down sharply because there's such a small number of people with websites who actually get lots of traffic. Then it goes over and you have this long tail where you have lots and lots and lots of people who get basically no traffic. And so it kind of declines from here where, almost 99% of the people who have a website, one end of that long tail, they get 3 views a month, and at the other end they get 0 views a month, and everybody else is between 3 and 0. And that pattern, that long tail pattern, where a very small minority gets the vast majority of the action, repeats itself almost everywhere. And it also could probably apply to things like, who actually does the work of getting things done. In any organization, you'll find a very small number of people that do almost everything, and this other large number of people who are ostensibly in the organization who do very little. Wikipedia is another example of that. Like a small number of editors do almost all of the editing on Wikipedia. I don't know, maybe they're getting paid by the Zionists, or they're able to live in their mom's basement.
There are big donors.
Right. So somebody, I think you're not supposed to get paid to edit Wikipedia the way somebody wants you to. However, unfortunately, that's obviously happening. But for whatever reason, you have a tiny percentage of all the Wikipedia editors doing almost all of the editing, and a huge number of ostensible Wikipedia editors who do very little. And that long tail graph, it's everywhere you look. For instance, here in Morocco, my wife and I were sort of joking because, we have this, a nice house. We had to do repairs and a little addition and stuff. And, there are a whole lot of people out there, handyman types, that probably aren't going to really do the job very well, to say the least. And we had a bad experience with a whole bunch of people like that. And, we joke that they're hashishis, and basically they just want to do enough work to get enough money for their next hash.
Yeah.
Right. So just like all these other areas of human endeavor, if you look at, who builds and maintains buildings, there's a long tail. Of all of the people who are supposedly at some level involved in building and maintaining buildings, there's a huge number of them. There's a tiny number that do almost all of the actual building and maintaining of buildings. And then there's this long tail of handymen, hashishis, who do a little tiny bit, but not so much. So anyway, given the reality of this, and maybe virtue is sort of like that too, Plato would say that there's a relatively small number of people who've cultivated a lot of virtue, or maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has inculcated them with that possibility, or even with that virtue. Prophets and saints are people that we think of in the very high end of that regard. So there are a very few people who are very, very, very virtuous. And then there are a lot of people who are really not so virtuous. And so if you say majority rule, well, you're just turning things over to the totally unvirtuous minority. So Plato and other classical philosophers would say that's probably not what you want. You want to find some way to get the virtuous into power. And I think that's what Islam tells us too. That the tradition is so who was the original leader of the community? It was Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was the most virtuous. And then the next, who's going to be the next caliph? Well, it's really about who's going to be the most virtuous. And Shia Islam sort of starts with people who believe that Ali, may Allah be pleased with him, should have been he was the most virtuous, and he was designated, right? Yeah. And then the other Sunni Islam says no, actually, that he was very young, and maybe he hadn't cultivated in any case, we all agree that the leader should be the most virtuous.
I think there's no denying, in my opinion, that the leader should be the most virtuous, but I think the problem comes with the implementation of the system itself. Like, there's a big argument that, for example, after the passing of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you had the bay'ah, you had bay'ahs, you had people coming and agreeing on having a caliph. So you had some sort of consensus. That's not something that shura and people approving, that's very important. However, all of what we're talking about, whether you talk about democracy or ruling by virtue or just dictator, I think all of them are due to human beings, and human beings in their essence, they make mistakes. And I always say that in any ruling system, really, what you should always have is, I call them review, refinement, and reform constantly. Because if you don't have, I call them the triple R, if you don't have review, refinement, and reform constantly, you start to lose. You start to spread corruption. And if you don't have people pushing the boundaries of the state will come on you to choke you. And I think this is where we're at in terms of the vast power that's in the hands of these people, whether they're controlling the media or buying your politicians or dictating the elections or creating the illusion in your head that it's only a possibility of this person versus that person, and there is no hope for a third person. Why? Because we're ignoring him anyway. It's not that he exists. They did that with Ron Paul, didn't they? Ron Paul had the good ideas at the time. And when you look back at the polls from 2008, whenever he used to lead as well, they would ignore him. It's as if he doesn't exist. So in people's heads, but most people's head, well, he does not exist. He isn't there. So many people in the US will not know, for example, Jill Stein or Cornel West or any alternatives. They'll see Kamala Harris and they will see Donald Trump. And it seems like it's still the case. And the answer to that would be something revolutionary in a sense, or very, very long term. If you want to talk about educating the people or raising more awareness, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're right about what were the R's? Review and
review, refinement, and reform.
Review, refinement, and reform. Absolutely. I think that's a really good insight. And that, of course, kind of goes with the tradition of shura, or consultation, in the Islamic tradition, that leaders, even though we do accept this principle of leadership, where if the leader, orders that you are supposed to go along with it, basically, to try to preserve the harmony of society. But there's also this obligation of the leader to seek consultation and get the best possible consultation, and that brings the reviewing of their decisions into play. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and then we have mechanisms now for that. I used to have this discussion with former Senator Mike Gravel, who was a very well-known senator from Alaska who stood up against the Vietnam War when he was a young member of the U.S. Senate. And became kind of a hero. He also was one of these alternative candidates that the media ignored and suppressed during the same period that Ron Paul was. I think Mike Gravel ran for the Democratic nomination, I believe in 2008, I think it was, either that or 2004. And he made some great remarks in the debates and so on. But anyway, he was an advocate of direct democracy. He believed that basically every legislative proposal should be just given to the whole society. And, we have the technology for that now. So everybody gets a chance to vote on every proposal. And I had to admit that, okay, it may be true that the majority of people may not be particularly virtuous, but if we had that system, the outcome would probably be much better than what we have now. And the reason for that is that even though average people in their great numbers may not be virtuous, and that crowds may be mad more often than they're wise, even so, the leadership that we have now is so vicious, it's so bad, that even just average people's common sense would be a lot better than what we have now. So I agreed with them to a point.
Yeah. You see, the interesting thing, even if you talk about Islamic tradition, you don't give the power to those who seek power. So there's a saying in Arabic that do not give the power to those who ask for the powerful position. You give the power to those who you see fit. Now, of course, there's a big argument into how can you find a mechanism to make that work. But it's an interesting observation when in many cases they point out the importance of having someone who isn't seeking the position of power, of president, of prime minister, for the sake of being in power, or for the sake of having deals, or for the sake of having things working for him, if that makes sense, or a career politician like all of them are. And again, I think the main thing is really to continue really raising awareness and understand the level of impact that the mainstream media has, because they are still powerful. Even with all of this social media talk, even with this these attempts of alternative media, they are still powerful to a very large extent. And when the people behind decide who wants to become president or put enough money into it, they will eventually manipulate the people to buy into it, and that's one of the furthest things away from democracy that can be.
Well, yes, the lies are really, in some ways, the worst part of all of this. That there's a sort of
Totally.
institutionalized hypocrisy and lying
Mm,
that spreads corruption throughout the whole society from the top to the bottom. With the
mm,
way that they just anointed Kamala Harris, even though the only time she actually ran, she had the most spectacularly unsuccessful campaign for the presidency in American history. She raised a huge amount of money. I forget how many tens of millions of dollars it was, and then got basically zero delegates, zero votes, zero interest, nothing, zero support in the polls, nothing. Like she couldn't buy anything because she's just not a very good candidate. And
mm,
then suddenly, when Joe Biden resigns a week after this interesting PR op of the ostensible Trump shooting, then the Democrats have to one up that, so they force out Biden, and then there's this choreographed kind of coronation of Kamala Harris, in which we're supposed to forget everything about her that we know, that she's not particularly competent or intelligent, that not particularly somebody that any sane person could imagine being president of the United States, and yet this superficial image that they're manufacturing gets spammed in everybody's face, and so all the people that don't like Trump just eat it right up, and this
mm,
is
mm.
but it's all based on lies, and and Trump lies too, but
Of course.
the mainstream media that calls out Trump's lies doesn't point out that
Mm.
actually Trump's pretty honest about the way he lies. He just like, hey, yeah, sure, I just make stuff up, and here, let me make something else up, which people kind of appreciate. It's kind of refreshing. Whereas the rest of them just lie
Mm,
systematically with a straight face and expect you to believe it.
mm, mm. Lovely. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining me again. Thank you for sharing the abundance of information. I highly enjoyed our conversation. For all of our viewers, I will keep links to Kevin's social media platforms so you can follow him. As usual, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you again in another show. Peace.